Welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. We are so glad that you would join us today as we continue to hear from a wide range of Aussie and global specialists and practitioners when it comes to multiplication and church planting. But before we jump into our episode today, we wanted to take a quick moment to tell you about our sponsor for this podcast, the Church Co. The Church Co is a website and app platform specifically designed for and with churches and church planters in mind. And the best part is that they actually build the website and app for you, so you don't have to spend exorbitant amounts of time, money, and energy learning a new tool. You might think that this would cost a whole bunch, but they are a ministry. And the price is similar to hosting a website at simply $29 a month. Also, the best part is that they are based here in Australia, so they understand the Aussie church and are building amazing tools with and for the Australian church in mind. So we want to strongly encourage you to check out the Church Co, as well as some promotional opportunities that we have with them. That's all from us for now, and we hope that you enjoyed this fortnight's episode of the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast.
Well, g'day there, and welcome to the Exponential Australia Podcast. We are so glad to be joining together again as we hear from a wide range of leaders from all around the globe, as well as in our backyard here in Australia, particularly when it comes to church planting and multiplication. And today, as we are every fortnight, but particularly today, we are joined by a very special guest in the form of Jeff Vanderstelt. Jeff, we are so glad to have you on our podcast today.
Thanks. It's so good to be here.
Awesome. Jeff, you are quite well known, particularly for those who have been around maybe the church ministry landscape, who have read some of your books. You're a very prolific author. You are currently based out of Washington. You are kind of leading several different organizations as well as across missional communities, and you speak a lot all around North America. I wonder, for those of our listeners who are joining today that are new to hearing your name, just give us a bit of a backdrop to who you are, your family, some of the things that you have been up to, and we're going to dive into some different parts of your more recent journey today as well.
Great. Yeah. Been married 31 years to Janie. We have 3 children, 2 that are in college, one that's actually graduating from the University of Washington in 2 weeks, another one that's in his second year of college, or uni, I think, as you guys like to say. And then our youngest is in her junior year. She's got 1 year left of high school, and she's also hoping to go to the University of Washington. So, which is nice because it's only about 15 miles away from where we live. So they get to have a college experience, and we get to see them a lot. So it's really fun. So that's a family. I'm presently the director of Saturate, which is a nonprofit that exists to help leaders collaborate together for gospel saturation of their city. And we work on 5 key initiatives, helping them collaborate around prayer, disciple making, leader health, serving their city together, and then starting new initiatives like new churches, new nonprofits, new businesses. So that's where I give most of my time. I also am on the board of SOMA. That's a family of churches that's global that I helped to found back in 2003. And so it's a joy to get to serve that. I don't get paid for that part of my work. I just serve it voluntarily. And then leading a small micro church in our house right now, and just got to baptize five people yesterday from that little church. So it's fun to see God already at work and making new disciples. Yeah, it's lots of fun. So that's the stuff I'm up to.
So good, Jeff. It sounds like, obviously you mentioned all of those things quite casually. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of story there. There's a whole bunch of how you found yourself in those kind of different environments. And I am going to pick up a little bit, particularly on, you mentioned Saturate. Saturate was a book that my wife and I read a number of years ago that deeply impacted us, and particularly the way we kind of were setting out to envision what it looked like to reach people and create that kind of community. One of the questions that often gets thrown around a lot, particularly in Australia, because it's not a new concept, because it's a deeply biblical concept, is that kind of idea of, visual communities or micro churches. For you, Jeff, straight off the bat, tell us about somehow that has become a deeply philosophical kind of approach to ministry that you've taken. And I'd love to hear some of your journey and how you found yourself in those types of environments.
Yeah, I think the discovery process for me was I was a youth pastor in three different church contexts. One was a very traditional, smaller church, and we saw students become disciple makers, and that youth ministry grew to be even larger than the church itself. So God just really blessed that work. Then I stepped into a very broken situation where the youth pastor had been sexually involved with the students, went to prison for it, had to rebuild a ministry, but once again saw students learn how to be disciple makers and saw a lot of their peers led to Christ. And in fact, I was just with one of them just recently who's now leading a multi-billion-dollar company, and him just saying, like, those are the best years of his life. They just formed him so deeply. And then I got called into what was a very broken situation at Willow Creek, and I led the student ministries there. But if you know much about Willow Creek, at that time it was about 25,000 people, and we had students driving sometimes an hour or two to get to the building, and we just realized you're not going to help them become disciple makers if everybody's got to drive that far. And how are you going to invite friends to join you on a 1 hour drive to some place they don't know what it's so foreign to them. So we decentralized that whole ministry into about 25, 30 locations where we taught students to lead stuff in their homes for their peers, lead them to faith, the whole thing. And so I think that's when I started cutting my teeth on the missional community expression, because I kept trying to figure out how do you help normal everyday people become disciple makers in their context. And we got to try it out with students. And then they went into the young adult ministry that Nancy Ortberg was leading at the time, and they did the same thing, and they called them house groups. And we saw so much fruit from that way of doing things. But I was being called to call all the students back into one centralized location because there was a new building that was going to get built, and they wanted to have a good case for why the youth needed a big room. And I'm like, I just don't need it. And so there was that, and several other things led me to finally step down from Willow and just have a deep conviction. We've got to figure out how to lead churches differently, because you don't make disciples in a room on Sunday. You make disciples in everyday life. And so you might inspire on Sunday, you might encourage on Sunday. There's things that can happen in a big room, but it's incredibly limited. And eventually Willow Creek acknowledged the same thing with their reveal document, saying that they really didn't make disciples who could make disciples the last 25 years of their existence. And so and that's very amazing that they said that. Most people wouldn't be willing to tell on themselves like they did, but they did. And so I had so much respect for their courage in doing that. But we decided we wanted to start a church where it was normal that everybody is a disciple maker. That's kind of was like that was our starting thing. And we said we can't do anything that would make it possible for people to think being part of a church as primarily observer is an okay thing. That just shouldn't be normal. They might be young in the faith, and just like our children, when they're born into our family, are limited in what they can do, but they know that they're going to grow up one day and be able to lead a family themselves. That's the whole idea. So we just treated our disciple making the same way. And as doing that, we realized we'd have to keep it like a family. And we knew that if the family got so big that we didn't have good parenting going on and good development going on, then it would no longer accomplish the purpose, which is why we landed on the missional community as the primary form, because we realized if you get much bigger than 15 to 25 people, you don't really know them that well, you can't develop them that well, and you can't help them all learn how to make disciples. And so we realized if you start one around 8 to 10 people and they reach as many people, it eventually be close to 20 people. And that's basically what we started. We just trained this first group in how to basically live out their life as a missionary in their neighborhood, and how to share Jesus, how to make a disciple, how to form them in the faith, how to grow them up, and how to teach them to do the same. And that's how we began. We started with one of those for a year. It took us about a year to help that one small group learn how to do it themselves. And when we launched, we didn't launch a service. We launched 4 missional communities. So we just said, you've all been trained. You can now go do it. They started doing it. Those missional communities multiplied over and over and over and over again until we had 70 or 80 missional communities and over 1,000 people on mission. So it was a pretty amazing journey. And we began to realize anybody can do this. And people would come and want to learn from us, and they'd show up on a Sunday. And we'd always tell them, you came to the wrong day. You're going to have to actually be with us during the week. So then we created a whole immersion training called Soma School, where they'd live with a family or a young couple or a single who was leading a missional community. And we just say, live with them for a full week and learn how to do it. We'll give you didactic training during the day, but in the afternoon and evening and the weekends, you're going to see how normal people live this out. And most of the leaders who went to Soma School at the end of the week would say, I really didn't believe everyday Christians could do this. Now I'm convinced they can, because I saw normal people with a full-time job living out the mission of God in their neighborhood or the community. So that's what really eventually led to the Soma family of churches, because people just started doing it, starting new churches. It started to go from the Northwest and Seattle to down the coast, the West Coast. Then it got into Texas, and it got other parts of the country, got into Canada, got into Australia, got to Japan, Eastern Europe. It's all over the place now. So we're just honored that God took a little seed and blew that thing all over the place. So.
Wow, Jeff. And it just kind of, particularly speaking to the Australian context, like I'm quite curious about, particularly in your journey, to find yourself in environments like Willow, yet then actually intentionally decentralizing something because you actually saw that there was greater opportunity to create a culture of disciple making. I think one of the things that I would observe occasionally about here in Australia is that sometimes we're more wedded to the model than we are to the mission that undergirds the model. And I just, like even that idea of like, it's quite a new term, but like multimodal, like we have ecosystems where it's not about the model of church that we're kind of proliferating. It's actually about how we're creating an ecosystem where everything is possible. And big is great for certain things. Small is really important for other reasons. Could you speak to that at all and some of your eclectic experiences there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the quick answer I would say is if your goal is disciple making, you'll do whatever it takes to make disciples. If your goal is something else, then you'll sacrifice disciple making. And so I don't know that it matters. I don't know that the size or the mode or model really matters as long as it's effective in making disciples, and then that you're honest about what isn't actually making disciples. Like that, I think that's having integrity. Like even my statement, getting together in a large group is great. It can do certain things, but it can't do everything. And if you're willing to acknowledge what it can't do and be more full of integrity around that, then you'll find out the other things you'll need to do in order to supplement what it can't do. And we see that in the ministry of Jesus. Like a lot of ways, it'd be hard to codify a particular model from Jesus's ministry because he's doing lots of different things in the different ways. And so he's got his ministry with the crowds. And yet we see it's limited. Like a lot of the crowd doesn't stay with him, but some of them follow him. Right. And so it has an ability to pull people closer. But after they get closer, he realizes that's not enough. So he's got to tell one guy to sell all he has and give to the poor and come follow him, because he realizes that's going to be the only way he's going to be able to be a disciple. But that doesn't become then the only way. We don't codify that and say, no, everybody has to sell everything they have and follow Jesus. Like that wasn't the model. It was just that person needed that. And so I think when we're pay attention to context, we pay attention to what we're trying to do in the context, we're willing to shift and reimagine for the sake of the mission. So like even me right now, I'm only doing a micro church. It's not because I think micro church is better, because at Soma, we had all those mission communities, but we gathered them together on Sunday. So we had hundreds and hundreds of people gathering still. I'm not doing that right now because the people that I'm trying to reach have told me they will not gather in a large group in a building. These non-Christians they're absolutely opposed to it. So I'm like, okay, we're not even going to try to do that because that's not going to help them come to know Jesus. Right. So I'm not so committed to gathering in a building in a large group that I'm unwilling to leave the 99 to go find the lost sheep. Yes. Like we're willing to do whatever it takes to go and make disciples of the people God gives us.
Wow. I love that, Jeff. And that would definitely be an encouragement I would suggest with the Australian church. Like I think we're still leading in that direction, historically due to a variety of factors. I think it was Anne Stanley who said occasionally we marry the model instead of marrying the mission. Of course, that comes from a certain framework, and yet he's committed to making disciples. And as a reminder for us as the church here in Australia, let's be quite open-handed about that. Whatever is actually going to be a vehicle to which allows us to make impact and make disciples. And I just want to kind of, before that, just to say, like, some of your books have been incredibly helpful. And so for any of our listeners that haven't yet gone to read those, we don't want to spend all of our time today talking about some you have spent a lot of time articulating, so people can go and kind of digress that. But the flip side where I want to take our conversation today is particularly off the back of the Exponential Global Conference. You were a main stage speaker there. It was wonderful to sit on some of your sessions. And of course, I'd always heard about you as the missional church guy or the missional communities guy. Yet as with all of us, your leadership journey has also taken on a new iteration, a new season. And you actually were spending a lot of your time, and it has become a real passion of yours, talking about, I guess, attachment and the interior life of a leader and how significant that is and should be, and particularly in this cultural moment with all we've seen, the ugly parts of the church in the West over the last 10 years. That's something that as the church we need to really have an eye on. I just wonder, firstly, tell us how it came about for you, and then I'd love to dive into some of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it came about when my best friend took his life. So he was a guy I'd mentored. He was a Timothy in the faith for me. I handed the leadership of the very first church I planted over to him. I did his wedding. He and his wife lived with us their first year of marriage, like as close as you can imagine of a friend I've ever had. And, PTSD from 3 tours of duty in war in Afghanistan and Iraq eventually caught up with him, and he took his life. And super sad. This is in November 2019. And that was a wall. So I hit a wall there, but there was years and years and years of ignoring my emotional world. As a young boy, I'd been told, you don't pay attention to your feelings. Big boys don't cry. All the things that you've probably heard as well. And a lot of young men, sadly, have been told this story. And yet here we have a Jesus who weeps. We have a Jesus who hurts. We have a Jesus who, experiences loneliness, crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Like, he has deep, deep feelings that he's not afraid to express. But I had basically told myself not to for 51 years. And probably not 51, probably starting when I was 8 years old. So do the math, 43 years. And then I'm in several very toxic church situations under some very broken leaders who I would say lean towards narcissism in the way that they led things, and as well as part of an organization, Acts 29, that was very broken. I'm not a part of it anymore, and I'm not trying to say something bad about them. It's just when I was in it, it was very broken. And I watched another one of our leaders, Darren Patrick, take his life as well. And so this starts piling up, and so when that all happened to me, I just went into a very dark space, and a lot of hopelessness, a lot of doubt, a lot of despair, a lot of questioning of everything. And it was really hard, and I needed to get help. And thankfully, some people around me connected me with a ministry called Tin Man Ministry. And it's based on the Tin Man from Wizard of Oz, who he didn't know he had a heart. And so it's, how do we get our heart back? And I met with a guy once a week for 14 months. And we just did work. He helped me feel my feelings, identify what those feelings were telling me I needed and what I wanted, and then learning how to go to God and people in healthy ways to start to attune. And in my attunement with my emotions and my needs, I could then rightly attach in ways I had never learned before. And what I didn't realize is I knew a lot about God, and I think I love God with my mind and with my strength, but I don't know that I loved him with my heart and my soul. And because I was not connected with myself, how could I actually love God with something I didn't know I had? And in a lot of ways, I wasn't able to bring my full self to God in my relationship. So that I was a very half-hearted or half-brained, you could say it that way too, relationship with God. And it's like my brain got awakened. Like the emotion center, the relational side of me started to come alive in ways I had never known before. And my capacity to feel grew, which was a little uncomfortable for quite a while, because I'd have these like moments where I'm like, why am I crying so much? Or why am I hurting so much? But it's like all those years of pretending that I was okay were piling up. And all of a sudden now I got to feel what I had failed to feel for so long. And I came alive like I'd never before. If my wife were on this podcast right now, she would say she got a different husband. She feels so much less lonely in her marriage because I'm more present than I used to be. My kids would say the same thing. In fact, now they actually encourage me to talk to their friends if their friends don't have a safe place to go to process their emotions. And so that's just transformed me, transformed my leadership. And now I help other people do the same work. And it's really interesting. Jesus prays in John 17, Father, as I am in you and you are in me, may they be in us. And we often use that about unity, but that's really attachment, right? And earlier in that prayer, he says, this is eternal life, that they would know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom he sent. We know that word know in the Bible is the same as almost like sexual acquaintance with. Like it's so intimate, and it's attachment is what it is. And that's why Jesus says in John 15, if you abide in me and I in you, you'll bear much fruit, but apart from me, you can do nothing. That's attachment. Yeah. And so what I realized is I had been doing all this stuff in almost a distance relationship with God. And when I got to get my heart back and be fully present with where I was, I could then be fully present with where he was with me. And so my abiding is so different than it was ever before. The depth of my love, the depth of my presence. I'm not only very present with myself and God, but people feel that I'm very present with them in ways I never could have been before. Yeah. So it's so transformed everything for me.
Mm-hmm. And you obviously mentioned, Jeff, that you've been in some very, well-known church environments, and, you've spoken about Willow and X29, and of course, we don't need to bring up horror stories. That's not the purpose of this podcast, but what would be your read on how much attachment can buy into those kind of leadership atrocities that we hear of? It seems to me those who go out there and sometimes try, and this is not a scathing remark about megachurch or anything like that, but try to build the biggest things, or A-type personalities, driven, Enneagram 8s or 3s who just tend to go, and yet there is this deprivation of their own interior journey that can come at great cost and will come out in the end.
Yeah, this I'll say this and caveat it that I don't think it's funny, but we used to make a joke within a circle I was in that if you wanted to have a really big church, you just need to have a really, really broken relationship with your dad. Because in a lot of ways it was a way to kind of earn your dad's favor, or to kind of win that approval over in a very detached form. Right. Yeah. And a lot of us, and me included, my dad loves me. I know he loves me, but he's a very hard worker. And the way he showed me that he loved me was probably more in his work and his provision than in his emotional attachment. And he couldn't do it, so I don't blame him. He didn't have a dad who did it with him. But I was prone then to go work for approval as well. And as an Enneagram 8, the more power, the bigger, the larger platform, all that feels like greater accomplishment, right? It feels like greater approval, greater significance. And so I think in a lot of cases, some of these platforms or growth are based upon trying to avoid self instead of fully embracing self, because some ways you get to remove yourself further from people if you have the excuse that you don't have to be with people. And a lot of times the larger something becomes, the easier it is to hide in it. I'm not saying that's what everybody's doing. I'm just saying I think that kind of culture can be easily fed by an avoidance of self, and what can be a very narcissistic, it's got to be all about me, but I'm also not present with me, right? And that's the dual edge of that kind of sickness. And then I think if we're not careful, we are prone to want to even get around those kinds of people. I think people that are attracted to those kinds of churches oftentimes aren't dealing with the interior self as well.
Yeah, well,
Again, it's not always the case, but I think it can be the case that there's a sense that we want to platform what we see in ourselves. Like, people are really negative about what happened in the last presidency with Trump. And I'm just like, you just saw who you are. That's all. Like, we elected our identity. That's what we did. And then we swung it another way. But either way, it's an expression of what's broken in us that we are afraid to address. And so I think that's happening a lot in the church as well. And I'm guilty of it. I'm not blaming everybody else. I'm saying, like, I was part of that problem, and I had to face that in myself. So yeah, I think if we're not careful, ministry can be a great way to avoid facing ourselves because we're constantly performing.
That's a good word, Jeff. And I wonder, particularly for those who are listening today, and maybe you have brought up some stuff in this, and that's a good conversation for every leader to participate in, is like, what parts of the shadow self do I need to confront and bring into the light? And it's such a key part of multiplication of church planning. I think for too long there has been this divorce of, we only talk about how we can get the job done and effectiveness, and yet we often neglect the interior. Like, for those of our listeners today that may be hearing some of what you shared, I'm like, where would you direct? What are some resources? What are some places that would be good starting point?
Yeah, before I give them, let me just remind everybody of Paul, his words to Timothy: keep a close watch on your life and your doctrine, and in doing both, you'll both save yourself and your hearers. And I think we've got to be as serious about our competency and our, capacity to know things as we are about our character. Like, we got to be as serious about our character as we are those other things. And so some resources I'd recommend, Voice of the Heart is a book that helps you articulate your emotions. The ministry, Tin Man Ministries, I'd highly recommend them. I also happen to be trained by them, so I get to help. Wow. I'm working with 12 guys right now that I'm helping them get healthy. I know that Pete Scazzero stuff is great too. You just got to have somebody do the work with you. And that would be my only warning. You just can't read a book. You've got to actually have someone on the other side of you telling you what it's like to experience you and what it's like to be on the other side of you. If you have no reflection back to yourself, you're not going to see the things you can't see. Someone else has got to help you see that. So make sure you don't do this journey alone if you want to get serious about your interior world.
Yeah, well. Jeff, the final question I wanted to ask you about today, and we were speaking offline, that you don't yet have any dates locked in, but we're hopeful that you might be coming out to Australia at some point this year because, of course, for those who don't know, there is an expression of Soma here in Australia. There's some great working happening here, particularly in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales. Tell us, if you can, like, if you've got much to add about your reflections of Australia, any hopes that you might have out here. I know I've been in conversations with several leaders about potentially coming out to Australia at some point.
Well, first, I'd love to come, and I know that we're hoping that I'll get to come out and encourage our family of churches. Would also love to do some stuff with Exponential. I'm going to be doing something online training, I think, in August or September, somewhere in there, that I'm looking forward to. It'll be some of the content that was in the book that shaped Exponential's global conference. But if I were to say something to the leaders in Australia, I would say some of what we've already said. Please don't be so devoted to your model or method that you're willing to sacrifice the mission of Jesus for it. And then second, make sure you're personally on the mission of Jesus, because I know a lot of leaders who actually aren't in the life of non-Christians and aren't making disciples themselves. And sadly, it's because a lot of them have never been discipled. And so they don't know how to pass on something they never received. So if that's you, find someone ahead of you. Even if you're a leader in the church, don't be so proud that you're not willing to admit that you still need someone pouring into your life. So look for someone who can begin to disciple you in ways maybe you have never been discipled, and live out whatever you're calling your people to live out, because the best way to lead people is by example, not by just your words.
Yeah. So good, Jeff. Well, hey, we've loved having you on the podcast today. It's been a breath of fresh air, both in terms of your vision for what pioneering in church planting can look like, but also, as you've just raised, it's two sides of the same coin. It can't be one or the other, it's actually both. And that attachment in a life is such a significant part of what it feels like the Lord is bringing to the church and see.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's good to be with you.